Welcome to part 2 of The Disciple. I have various reasons that every milestone is my favorite, but I would say for me personally, this milestone may have had the most significant impact on me at the time I first researched it and wrote it. And then every time I go through it with others, I'm challenged to see all the areas I still need to grow, but inspired to keep learning to be a better discipler of my children and others. I hope your experience is similar, and I look forward to continuing to journey through this collection of resources and experiences that have shaped my family and others for many years now. Before we get started though, let me make sure you found the resources that go along with these videos. They're all located on our Milestones webpage under The Disciple. Some are supplemental materials, and others give you a summary of exactly what I'll be sharing, particularly in the second part. So for all you note takers, check those out before you get a hand cramp trying to keep up. All right, so at the end of part 1, we started talking about disciple making beyond just commands, correction, and consequences. Having simplified our overwhelming commands with some clear and loving rules, let's move on to the second word, correction. It's pretty easy to find things to correct in our children. They mess up all the time. But correction alone often doesn't engage them at a heart level as much as good communication might. This quote challenges me every time I teach this seminar. The finest art of communication is not learning how to express your thoughts, it's learning how to draw out the thoughts of another. Are we teaching our children that a good talk for us is a good listen for them? I wish I had been thinking about this quote more that morning when I couldn't get Abby to get ready for school. For some reason, I was too zeroed in on getting things done and correcting her, rather than thinking about how we could better communicate. Shepherding a child's heart offers many great ways to communicate with our kids before, during, and after what I like to call discipling opportunities, rather than punishable offenses or whatever else you might consider discipline moments. I've added to his list in various ways and want to expand our vision for correction to include many more forms of communication. First is encouragement. It's communication designed to inspire and fill with hope and courage, especially through reminding of God's love and promises. It's been suggested that good discipline will make 10 encouragement deposits for every 1 correction withdrawal we make from our child's emotional bank account. My mom loved the phrase, catch your child in the act of doing good, and tried to do that far more often than correcting our mistakes. Or another way to think about encouragement is to consider the tone of your home. Is your home tone more negative than positive, where you find yourself in correction mode more often than encouragement mode? This question has stood out to so many families who have taken this seminar that we eventually spent an entire year focusing on home tones at our winter and summer getaways, and it had a profound effect on all of us. So if you need to work on this, you're not alone, and don't be afraid to ask for some help. One specific resource that has shifted things toward a more encouraging home tone for many parents is learning to identify gifts gone awry. I've got a full list of these in the resources online, but let me give you a few examples of what this might look like. If you've got a child arguing with you, you can encourage them about being honest about their feelings, knowing that arguers often will adopt your position eventually because they've had the chance to hash out their thoughts. If you've got a complaining kid, you could first respond by encouraging them for noticing potential problems that might need to be addressed, knowing that complainers can become excellent problem solvers with the right coaching and affirmation. And if you have a strong-willed little one driving you nuts, celebrate their assertiveness and encourage their leadership potential while guiding them toward gentleness along the way. I remember one of our younger interns showing how glad she was that her older sister's bossiness was finally paying dividends as she became one of the main leaders in our internship program. Starting with this type of solid encouragement foundation can be such a game changer as kids sense you're with them, not against them. And from there, you can move on to some other forms of communication as needed, like correction. Correction is communication that provides insight into something that is wrong in our child's behavior and helps them understand a remedy that realigns them with God's standards. Correction is communication that provides insight into something that is wrong in our child's behavior and helps them understand a remedy that realigns them with God's standards. Tone is definitely key here. So seek to make empathy versus anger your guide. It's tough being a kid. They just don't have control over so much of what's going on in them and around them. So why wouldn't we expect them to need lots of correction as they lose control of themselves and things get messy? We are disciplers, so getting to walk through lots of messy moments with our kids is what we signed up for as parents. They've got so much to learn, and we have the privilege of guiding them. So instead of dreading messes and getting angry, expect them and offer empathy as you embrace the opportunity to disciple them towards God's best. A third type of communication that sometimes gets enmeshed then with correction, but needs to stay separate, is rebuke. Rebuke is communication that censures a behavior, allowing your child to appropriately experience your sense of alarm, shock, or dismay at their words or actions. When I saw Abby getting ready to slam the car door on her sister's arm to stop her from getting in, an immediate rebuke was needed. "Stop!" I yelled. And it worked because rebukes are used sparingly with our kids. I grew up knowing a family where every discipline moment, including just calling kids to dinner, involved yelling and screaming. I saw one of their children just retreat inward and the other quit listening at all, which makes sense. If too much of what you say is at DEFCON 1, then your voice loses its power to disciple. So use rebukes sparingly and always follow them up with other forms of communication like some calmer correction and maybe some instruction. Instruction is communication that provides a lesson, a precept, or information that will help your child better understand God and their world. I again want to make sure this form of communication isn't just conflated with correction. Yeah, sometimes a little instruction might go along with a time of correction where you want to teach your child something that will help them avoid repeating a mistake they just made. But trying to instruct, which often means lecture, an emotionally distraught child who just transgressed in some way often doesn't go well. I found that our best instructions times come during car rides, morning devotions, bedtime reading, mealtime conversations, or family nights, when everyone's in a good space and we can talk about discipleship matters before they happen, or at least outside of the time when they have just happened. Instruction can involve Bible reading, memory verses, Christian books, audiobooks, family devotionals, or simply sharing something God is doing in your life. At times, going through any of this might seem difficult or even painful. My brother-in-law put it well after he and I tried to lead our families through a devotional on honoring one another that seemed totally chaotic. He said, "The fruit of this doesn't come during the instruction, but rather when the next kid doesn't honor someone, and we've already got language and concepts to work with as we disciple them through it." Parents often say that this form of communication is the one that they've neglected most and want to work on more. And that makes sense. It's preemptive communication that requires more forethought, but sets you up for better connections to God and each other later on. And then finally, don't forget prayer. Prayer is communication with God that helps your child build a relationship with the one who can truly transform them and gives us the opportunity to pay attention to God's work in them and us. Praying after a teachable moment can help point our children to God as the one who they ultimately need for forgiveness, strength, and loving relationships. Prayer can enhance any of the previous forms of communication too. Praying blessings over our kids can encourage them. Praying with our kids after a time of correction or rebuke can help them know forgiveness and grace. And having our kids repeat after us or just listen to our prayers is a great way to instruct them on how to pray themselves. Oh, and especially remember prayer when you're heading in to deal with the 20th messy situation of the day and you know you're ready to explode. Even those quick desperation prayers can save you and your child lots of heartache as you center yourself on God's call to disciple those crazy kids He's entrusted you with. So those are 5 forms of communication that hopefully broaden your vision for what correction looks like. Let's take some time to reflect on those by considering these questions. So, we've talked about moving beyond commands to good rulemaking. We just discussed that correction is only one of many ways we can communicate God's love and truth to our kids. And now we get to the final C, consequences. For a long time, I thought that every act of disobedience needed a tangible punishment or consequence. And I clearly still had that philosophy in the story I shared in part 1 about employing every consequence imaginable to get Abby to go to school when she was in kindergarten. But rather than a consequence or punishment, what I really think every act of disobedience needs is a discipling response where we focus on training them to realign their life with following Jesus. What follows is a set of 10 responses that we can offer our kids when their behavior is expressing a heart that is not in line with God's best for them. It's simpler to just have a one-size-fits-all discipline technique, but the reality is that every kid is different, and every child goes through many different seasons. So imagine yourself as an artist who needs a full palette of colors to bring a vibrant landscape to life. And even if creativity isn't a strength, I hope these discipling responses can give you some clear options for trying some new things or tweaking some of what you already do to make discipleship a blessing for you and your kids. So for your first brushstroke, try number 1, winning them with an opposite attitude. Kids are moody, but that doesn't mean you have to be. Instead of scolding them for their moodiness, be playful or over-the-top positive, fun, or even silly. Try saying things like, "Do I hear whining? Oh, I don't speak that language. Am I going to have to tickle you until you get out of bed for school? Oh no, I'm so sorry. I think I put grumpy pants on you today. Do you want to go up and change to new pants?" Or get really creative and fantasize with your kids about how you wish something could happen that they want too. So, in response to a child who doesn't want to do their chore of taking their plate to the sink after dinner, you could say, "You know, I don't like clearing the dishes either. But wouldn't it be nice if a magical unicorn could come right now and clear away all of our dishes so none of us had to take our plates over to the sink?" And then as you chuckle about that wish, you can clear the table together. These whimsical ways can at least lighten your mood, and hopefully they help with your kids' mood as well. Number 2, offer 2 acceptable choices. This works particularly well for children who place a high value on independence. Offering 2 acceptable choices allows your child to maintain a sense of choice and independence while also helping them honor and obey. Instead of "no toys at the table," try, "Would you like to put your toy under your chair or on the counter while you eat?" Rather than "Ayani, it's time to take a bath now," try, "Ayani, would you like to take a bath now or in 5 minutes?" Then set a timer for 5 minutes. The timer has been a huge help for us in creating almost a third-party presence. It's not my fault we have to stop the preferred activity, it's the timer. And then we can work together rather than opposition. Plus, it gives the child a chance to process the transition rather than just flip a switch that most kids don't have. Number 3, logical consequences. When possible, try to find a natural consequence that has a logical connection to the misbehavior. When I don't change my oil, I don't lose screen time. I eventually get stuck on the side of the road with a broken down car. Helping our kids experience life in a similarly realistic way can be much more formative than just punitive. You threw that toy at your sister, it's going bye-bye. You didn't clean up those blocks I asked you to? Well, I guess they'll be going in the basement for a while. One important caution with consequences, though, is that you can't pile them on more and more. After you get beyond 1 or 2 consequences, the child will be fairly overwhelmed with trying to keep them all straight. If logical consequences aren't working, move on to another response, such as number 4, offering to help. Preschoolers are active creatures, so discipling them will require lots of activity on our part. Sometimes the hardest thing for us is simply having to stop what we're doing and go over and disciple them. Help is a good word for young children because it involves literally helping them to perform a task that you've asked them to do. Your firm, calm offer to help will be a clear indicator that something is not right because your tone and facial expression will demonstrate that their disobedience is not acceptable. Going over to help them then involves physically helping them perform the task or stop some behavior. Eventually the phrase, "Do I need to come help?" will be enough to cause obedience because preschoolers tend to prefer doing things themselves. This is not something that will work much beyond preschool, but showing them how much obedience matters and your willingness to help them learn it is a great foundation to build upon. Number 5, spanking. This one is highly controversial. People often point toward Proverbs 13:24, which says, "Spare the rod and you'll spoil the child," as justification that we need to spank or else we'll mess up our kids. But the literal application doesn't seem as likely as the more figurative interpretation, which simply affirms what this milestone is all about, using discipline well as a means to disciple your child. And current brain research suggests that spanking a child who is already experiencing violent tantrums or intense emotions actually diminishes access to and growth of the frontal lobe of the brain, which is where regulation and empathy skills are developed. In other words, spanking may lead to short-term behavior modification, but the research isn't seeming to support long-term heart change. That being said, I know families who have used spanking or tapping on the hand with certain kids effectively. The key is to read a lot about it and make sure it isn't just a reactive way to express your own anger and get short-term compliance at the expense of long-term relationship and formation. So while I think other forms of discipline are probably more effective, if you do want to make spanking part of your discipling responses, make sure it is never done in anger and be sure to study up on it carefully. Number 6, focus on the good, not the bad. When kids act out and get attention for it, they often can't parse out the negative versus the positive energy they receive. It's attention, and they'll take whatever they can get, particularly when they're under stress. So sometimes the best response is to ignore the bad behavior as much as possible and double down on praising the good behavior. It might mean praising a child for cleaning up the 2 toys instead of pointing out the 17 that are still out. Or it could involve lavishing love on their sibling who was hurt and almost ignoring the child who hit them. You can eventually address the other child later when things are calmer, but they will miss out on the heightened energy they may have been seeking. Or the most challenging but sometimes only helpful option is to actually let them get away with some bad behaviors while you continue to hold up all the good ways you see them loving others and God well. This response overall, and especially that last suggestion, might be the most counterintuitive reaction, but particularly with oppositional children who have anxiety or anger or other clinically defined special needs, it might be the best way to play the long game of discipleship versus the short, quick fix of behavior modification. Number 7, take a break. Though this one might just sound like another form of the common timeout, let me assure you that we found taking a break to be a major upgrade. Timeouts are usually just a punishment involving dismissing a child from the family or their preferred activities for a set amount of time, often associated with their age. 1 minute for 1-year-olds, 2 minutes for 2-year-olds, etc. The problem is, there's nothing magical about that set amount of time being sufficient for helping a child calm down or learn how to re-enter community in a positive way. This deficiency jumped out at me when Caleb, as a 1.5-year-old, hit his sister and then sat right down on a step for his 1-minute punishment. But clearly the joy of hitting his sister was far greater than the pain of having a timeout. So learning about taking a break was huge. Rather than simply being a punishment, giving our kids a break has led to so much more discipleship. It starts with the same first step, sending them to their room or other designated space to take a break. But then things get quite different because the break could be 30 seconds or 30 minutes. It's up to them. And they can even play with toys or do any other activity they think will be helpful to calm down. Then it's up to them to call to us and say, "I'm ready." And that means they're ready for a conversation about what happened. The conversation has 4 main parts then. First, helping them name what they did wrong and how it impacted others. Second, talking about a different way they could handle things in the future. Third, choosing a way to make things right by cleaning up a mess, saying sorry, or some other kind gesture like giving a hug. And finally, we pray for them, ideally while holding, hugging, or touching them in some reconnecting way to remind them of God's forgiveness and ours. When we made the switch, we had to explain everything through some preemptive instruction. At times, we had to take them kicking and screaming to their room and stay with them to keep them in their break. And we've had them say they're ready, but then refuse to talk about anything, so we send them back to their break time. Overall, though, they embraced the idea pretty well, as we told them it wasn't meant to be a punishment, but simply a way for them to get out of their distressed space and get back to a place where everyone could feel great. Eventually, it got to the point where sometimes just suggesting that they might need a break would be all they needed to get back on track. But the best part overall is that the break leads to Christ-centered communication and connection. And the last 3 responses can all enhance that communication. Number 8, ask the right questions and empathize. Why did you, lines of questioning, may just be over our kids' heads. Preschoolers especially truly may not know. Instead, what were you feeling when you hit your sister? What did your brother do that made you mad? Help me understand how hitting her seemed to make things better. What was the problem with what he was doing to you? In what other ways could you have responded? These questions can tie in well with the reflection time after a child takes a break and you want to process what happened. But sometimes, if the child is able to talk right away, you may find that asking a few good questions could help you ascertain what the problem was and how to fix things without more than a conversation. Either way, as you gain insight into what the child was feeling or thinking, empathize. I can see why you were mad. That would make me mad too. I've wanted to hit people too at times. That must have felt awful to be so upset that you responded in that way. Let's figure out a way to change that for next time. Our goal is not to tell them that their emotions are necessarily wrong or unwarranted. We're just trying to help them choose a godly path for expressing how they feel in light of the reality that we probably felt similarly ourselves at times. Number 9, joint problem solving. Telling our kids what to do is a tempting practice, but not good pedagogy. Instead, help them name the problem and then see if they have ideas for solving it with you. Even if you suggest all the actual ideas, they'll feel ownership because you included them and gave them the chance to choose a plan that develops their problem-solving abilities. So knowing one of my kids struggles to leave a home when we're visiting them, I would go to her about 5 minutes before we had to head out and ask if she had any suggestions for how I could help her transition to the car. After many previous battles, I loved how joint problem-solving made things so much smoother. And finally, number 10, do-overs and drills. This is a great way for a child to go make something right after taking a break. But it also can work on its own when a child comes and demands, "Give me lunch." We can say, "Whoa, how about a do-over? Try that again." Or when toddler Caleb hit my face while we were wrestling, it made total sense. So I just took his hand, showed him how to gently touch a face, and had him do it himself. He just needed to learn, and the do-over was perfect for that. But don't assume this is just for kids. Grown-ups need do-overs too. So if your tone gets harsh or you totally botch a discipling opportunity, own it, ask for forgiveness, and then model the do-over for your children by going back and doing it over. What a win relationally, spiritually, and formationally. One dad came home grumpy from work and immediately yelled at his kids for fighting. Realizing his tone was awful, though, he literally stopped, asked for a do-over, went back outside, and came back in with a totally different attitude that changed the whole tone of things for everyone. And another form of the do-over that takes it up a notch is what I call drills. When a child repeatedly struggles to honor you or others with a particular behavior, the consequence can simply be to set aside a time to practice the correct behavior multiple times until they seem to have it down. I used to drive a 2-door Honda Civic, and when I finally got tired of reaching over to pull the door closed for our first grader who refused to do it every morning at school drop-off, I decided a drill was needed. So after school, I showed the child how to close the door, giving the benefit of the doubt that the child didn't know how to push something. And then I set the goal of doing it 5 times to get the hang of it. The next day, when the child started to leave without closing the door, I asked if more practice was needed, and that seemed to inspire them to tap into those newfound door-closing skills. And my back was saved from that crazy stretch across 2 seats. Well, those are 10 discipling colors to try painting with. I'll bet some of them are things you're already doing well. Some might offer a few tweaks you'd like to make, and a few might be brand new ideas you could give a try. Let's pause here to review and reflect by considering these questions. Well, there's one final response I need to close with. The discipler's uber response, as I like to call it, is grace. Grace is the heart of the gospel. So training disciples without using lots of it will certainly result in failure. Building a grace-based relationship with your child pretty much trumps any other objective or technique we have. I love this quote from the book, Grace-Based Parenting, where they switch us from painting to dancing to highlight the creativity we need to employ. Raising children isn't a march with a distinct left-right cadence. It's a flowing dance where the rhythms change all the time. When we insist on distilling our roles in our children's lives down to a predictable cadence, especially in areas where they're helpless, we may live in quieter homes and sleep sounder at night, but we may miss the greater opportunity to equip a child with a large capacity to hope and trust. Parenting hopeful children isn't convenient, just kind. As I walked away from that miserable morning drop-off when Abby was in kindergarten, Sarah Gardenius, Pastor Chris's wife, saw me and saw Abby going to school crying. She asked me what had happened, and I explained a little. She shared that their house had melted down at dinner time the previous night as well for no apparent reason. And instead of demanding that they all come to dinner, they just took dinner up to them and then put them all to bed early. I realized then that I had tried out all the ideas from all sorts of books I had read, but I had forgotten grace-based parenting. I ran home, and despite feeling like Abby deserved to not have her book, I knew that my relationship with her was far more important. So I got the book, ran it back to school, and gave it to her teacher. It was probably the only thing I did right that morning, though I tried really hard. I then called one of the parents I had consulted for this seminar. I wanted to get some more ideas to help out those other parents who needed to learn about discipline. She was super helpful, and I think it was in that conversation that so many things began to click as she explained the artful, grace-saturated, creative ways we needed to go about parenting. When I got home that night, Abby immediately talked about me bringing her the book, and I could tell that our hearts were reconnected just by that act. And with hearts connected, we continued a conversation throughout the evening, where I named how awful the morning felt and my desire to no longer keep taking her animals away each morning. We then primarily used the joint problem-solving discipling response to come up with a plan for how to help Abby get up and get ready each morning. Initially, she had no ideas herself, but as I presented some different possibilities, she latched on to various concepts. We named all the little problems and came up with fun or helpful ways to handle each one. She went to bed excited to try out the plan the next morning, and it went really well. I got up 10 minutes earlier to make sure I had plenty of time to walk Abby through everything. I went in and then said good morning and started rubbing Abby's back. After a minute of that, I started singing one of Abby's favorite worship songs, 10,000 Reasons. She seemed to really love it, and I seemed like she was so relaxed I feared she might not be able to get out of bed. But the next step I thought was to pick her up and take her out of her bed, and I prepped her for that. But then she suddenly perked up and said, "No, you forgot that I'm supposed to blink 3 times," because we had tried to figure out how to stop her from whining because the room was so bright. So we blinked 3 times. Then I didn't even have to pick her up out of bed. She just got right up. From there, I helped her with getting dressed, but had her do some of the hard stuff that she was still learning, and she was willing to push through it. And we had a really good morning from there that continued through the rest of the year with minor adjustments along the way. I'm now many years removed from that first major attempt at trying out the concepts I suggest throughout this seminar. Some are no longer as necessary, and others are needed regularly. I still have so much to learn, but looking back, I'm thankful for the ways that God has used my kids to disciple me as I try to disciple them. So I hope you'll take time in the coming days to prayerfully walk through what we've talked about in these 2 seminars and check out the resources that we've included on the Milestones webpage, including an exercise called the Disciple Project that brings together everything we've shared to help you address current issues with your children. And now, friends, may God bless you as you go on this discipleship journey. May He meet you and your children powerfully, even in the midst of the most difficult behavioral challenges and heart issues. And may your whole family know and experience His transformational and life-giving grace. Amen.